She stood in the parking lot, gripping a phone, furious that her so-called master key wouldn't open my car. Within minutes, flashing lights rolled in because she had just called 911 and claiming a crime was in progress. To her, I was just another resident who needed to be put in their place by the HOA. What she didn't know was that this moment, this tiny act of entitlement, was about to flip her entire world upside down. Power, authority, and humiliation were about to collide in the most public way possible. And when the truth came out, nothing in that neighborhood would ever be the same again. Before everything went sideways, life in that neighborhood was quiet in the way people hope for when they move somewhere new. Clean streets, neatly painted lines in the parking lot, trimmed hedges, and a set of rules everyone silently agreed not to think too hard about, as long as nothing went wrong. I lived there like anyone else. I parked where I was allowed, paid my dues on time, nodded politely at neighbors, and kept my head down. It wasn't home exactly, but it was stable, predictable, and drama-free. Most days followed the same rhythm. Early mornings, a quick walk past the community mailbox, the soft hum of cars coming and going, and the occasional HOA notice taped to the bulletin board near the entrance. They were usually harmless reminders: trash day, pool hours, parking etiquette, nothing that felt personal, nothing that hinted at the kind of authority some people were just waiting to misuse. The HOA board, at least on paper, existed to keep things running smoothly. Most residents barely knew who was on it, and that was the point. If you weren't causing problems, they stayed invisible. But there was one exception. One woman who seemed to treat her role less like a responsibility and more like a badge. She walked the property with purpose, clipboard in hand, eyes always searching for something out of place. People whispered about her more than they talked to her. I noticed small things at first: a note under my windshield wiper reminding residents about unauthorized parking, a glance that lingered too long whenever I locked my car, a comment made loud enough to hear about people who think rules don't apply to them. None of it was direct, but it carried a message. Someone was watching. Still, I brushed it off. HOA politics thrive on overreaction, and I had no intention of giving anyone a reason to escalate. My car was registered, my spot was valid, I wasn't breaking a single rule. There was no reason for conflict, at least none that made sense. What I didn't know was that in her mind, compliance wasn't enough. Control was, and somewhere between her clipboard, her authority, and a key she believed could open anything, a line was about to be crossed, a line that would turn an ordinary day in a quiet community into a moment no one there would ever forget. What started as subtle scrutiny slowly turned into a pattern I couldn't ignore. Every time I returned to my car, there was a sense that something had shifted, like the air itself carried tension. The parking area, once just a place to come and go, began to feel like a stage where someone else thought they were in charge. The same woman was always nearby, always watching, always taking notes. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was constant, and that constancy was deliberate. The first fine arrived without warning. A neatly printed notice claimed my car had been parked improperly during restricted hours. The accusation made no sense. I checked the posted rules, reread them twice, then a third time. I was well within compliance. The fine wasn't large, but it wasn't about the money. It was about the message. Someone wanted me to know they could reach into my life whenever they wanted. I disputed it calmly, following the process exactly as outlined. Days passed, no response. Then another notice appeared, this time for the same issue, same vague wording, different date. It felt less like enforcement and more like provocation. Around me, other residents started acting differently. Conversations cut short, eye contact avoided. People had learned that being noticed by the HOA meant trouble, and no one wanted to be collateral damage. The rules themselves seemed to change depending on who was enforcing them. Overnight, parking spaces were re-evaluated. Stickers appeared on certain vehicles, including mine, marked for review. There was talk of towing, of booting, of escalating penalties. None of it was clearly explained. Ambiguity became a weapon. If the rules were unclear, they could always claim you'd violated something. I began documenting everything. Dates, notices, photos of my car exactly where it was supposed to be. Each step I took to protect myself only seemed to irritate her further. The looks grew sharper. The walks around the lot became more frequent. It was no longer about order, it was about dominance, and she wanted compliance that went beyond the rule book. Then came the warnings about unauthorized access. Notices circulated reminding residents that only HOA-approved personnel were allowed to handle vehicles in the lot. The irony was almost laughable considering what was about to happen. At the time, it felt like posturing, an attempt to intimidate without action. But intimidation, when repeated often enough, turns into expectation. One evening, I returned later than usual. The parking lot was quiet, lights humming overhead. As I approached my car, something felt off. The space around it was disturbed, like someone had been standing too close, too long. Nothing was damaged, nothing was missing, but the sense of violation lingered. I checked the doors, locked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that boundaries were being tested. The next morning, another fine appeared. This one claimed my vehicle had been interfered with during an inspection. The wording was careful, almost clever. It implied concern while assigning blame. According to them, my car had been part of an HOA compliance check. I hadn't authorized anything. No one had notified me. Yet somehow the responsibility was mine. That's when frustration turned into resolve. I realized this wasn't going to stop on its own. The HOA wasn't correcting behavior. They were manufacturing infractions. And she was at the center of it all, wielding her position like a personal tool. The community that once felt neutral now felt hostile, controlled by one person's unchecked authority. Rumors started circulating, whispers about a master key the HOA supposedly had for emergencies, a key that could unlock gates, storage units, even vehicles under certain conditions. Most people dismissed it as exaggeration. Others shrugged, saying it was probably legal. The idea alone was unsettling. Power without oversight always is. Days later, I saw her standing near my car again, closer than before. No clipboard this time, just her, focused, determined. The tension was thick enough to feel. Whatever line she'd been inching toward, she was about to cross it. And when she did, it wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be private. It would drag everyone, residents, authorities, and the entire HOA into a confrontation they weren't prepared for. Because the next step she took wasn't just harassment, it was an accusation. And once that call was made, there would be no walking it back.
The moment arrived without warning, collapsing weeks of quiet intimidation into a single, irreversible instant. I was walking back toward my car when the scene froze into something unreal. Her standing inches away from it, hand clenched around a phone, posture rigid with authority she believed was unquestionable. The air felt charged, like a storm breaking open. This wasn't another warning. This wasn't another fine. This was escalation at its highest level. Emergency lights began to reflect off windshields, splashing red and blue across the quiet lot. Heads turned, doors opened, curtains shifted. Whatever narrative she had spun into that call, it had brought real consequences crashing down on the entire community. She stood firm, convinced she had finally forced the situation into her favor. In her mind, this was the ultimate enforcement, power validated by sirens. The accusation hung heavy in the air. A crime, an unauthorized vehicle, a defiant resident refusing to comply. She watched with visible satisfaction as the attention shifted toward me, certain this was the moment I would be publicly corrected, maybe even removed. Her confidence was absolute. The master key she'd boasted about, the call she'd placed, the authority she'd been flexing for weeks, it all led here. But control has a way of collapsing when it's built on assumptions. As the situation unfolded, the tone shifted, not suddenly, but unmistakably. The scrutiny she directed outward turned inward. Procedures were questioned, permissions examined, authority clarified. The very rules she had been wielding like weapons began to work against her. The presence she expected to reinforce her power instead exposed it. The realization crept across her face slowly. The certainty drained first, replaced by confusion. Then came panic. The attention of the officers wasn't where she wanted it anymore. The questions weren't aligning with her story. The authority she thought she was invoking didn't recognize her version of events. In trying to control the narrative, she had overplayed her hand. The truth landed hard and publicly. The call she made wasn't justified. The access she claimed wasn't legitimate. The key she believed gave her control had no place in this situation. What she framed as enforcement now looked like intrusion. What she called compliance now looked like abuse. And the audience she'd unintentionally gathered saw it all. The shift was electric. The power dynamic flipped in real time. The whispers became murmurs. The murmurs became clarity. This wasn't an HOA doing its job. This was one person crossing a line and dragging emergency services into a personal vendetta. The weight of that mistake settled visibly on her shoulders. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, just the quiet, devastating unraveling of someone realizing too late that authority doesn't come from confidence alone. It comes from legitimacy, and hers had evaporated in front of everyone. The parking lot, once a place of silent intimidation, became a courtroom without walls. Every notice she'd issued, every fine she'd pushed through, every moment she'd loomed over residents with implied power, now felt exposed. The system she'd manipulated turned its gaze on her, and it did not look away. As the lights faded and the tension settled, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a bad call, it was a turning point. A line had been crossed in public, documented, undeniable. The HOA's authority, once feared, rarely questioned, now stood under scrutiny because of one person's actions. And as she stood there, stripped of the control she thought she had, the reality hit harder than any fine ever could. The power she abused was never truly hers, and now the consequences were no longer avoidable. What happened next wouldn't just decide her future in that community, it would reshape how power was handled there forever. The aftermath didn't explode the way the confrontation had. Instead, it unfolded slowly, deliberately, and with far more impact than any shouting ever could. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt different, quieter, but not with fear, with awareness. People who had once avoided eye contact now lingered a little longer outside. Conversations restarted. The silence that had protected abuse was finally broken. The HOA moved fast, not out of accountability at first, but out of self-preservation. Notices were sent out clarifying rules that had never been clear before. Parking policies were suddenly rewritten in plain language. Emergency access procedures were walked back, redefined, and stripped of the vague authority that had allowed one person to weaponize them. The master key rumor vanished entirely, as if it had never existed. And the fines, every single one tied to that pattern of harassment, were quietly rescinded. No public apology ever came. It rarely does. But the shift was unmistakable. The woman who once patrolled the lot with confidence stopped appearing altogether. When she did surface weeks later, she was different, quieter, cautious, no longer carrying herself like someone untouchable. Her power hadn't been taken from her in a dramatic vote or a loud meeting. It had simply evaporated once exposed to daylight. The HOA board, forced into scrutiny they never expected, faced pressure from residents who had finally seen what unchecked authority looked like. Attendance at meetings tripled, questions got sharper, demands for transparency became impossible to ignore. Policies that had been rubber-stamped for years were challenged line by line. The system didn't collapse, but it changed, and that change was permanent. For me, the victory wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about restoration. My life returned to normal, not the quiet kind that comes from compliance, but the kind that comes from knowing your rights are intact. I parked without checking over my shoulder. I walked through the community without feeling watched. The sense of violation was replaced with something stronger, certainty. What struck me most was how many neighbors later admitted they'd experienced similar treatment, fines that didn't make sense, warnings that felt personal, intimidation disguised as procedure. They hadn't spoken up because they believed resistance would only make things worse. Seeing one incident unravel publicly gave them permission to stop accepting it. That's the real impact of moments like this. Abuse of power doesn't survive exposure, it survives silence. Once the illusion breaks, once people realize authority only works when it's legitimate, everything changes. The rules don't disappear, but fear does. HOAs, neighborhoods, institutions of any kind are only as fair as the people watching them. When oversight vanishes, control fills the gap. But even if one person refuses to be quietly pushed, the balance shifts back where it belongs. The experience left me with a lesson I won't forget. Power doesn't come from titles, keys, or confidence. It comes from accountability. And the moment someone uses authority to intimidate instead of protect, they've already lost it. They just don't know it yet. That night in the parking lot wasn't the end of a dispute. It was the beginning of awareness, a reminder that ordinary people don't need to seek conflict to stand their ground. Sometimes all it takes is letting the truth surface and watching false power collapse under its own weight.